Foreign Audrey Morris was getting ready to become a mother and couldn't help but worry that it would be incredibly hard to raise 3 kiddos. What made things even scarier was the fact that it was the woman's first pregnancy. At first, Audrey didn't know that she had a multiple pregnancy and only found out that she was having triplets during her 12-week ultrasound. Can you even imagine it? Dear, you'll be a dad to 3 babies at once. This is some kind of a miracle, the woman exclaimed happily. But one look at the gloomy face of her husband was enough to understand that he didn't share Audrey's excitement over the news. Derek had always been a rather greedy and cautious man who was used to saving every cent. Therefore, the news of having 3 babies at once came as a huge blow to him. Derek's rich imagination immediately brought up images of a bunch of kiddos screaming and kicking, always demanding attention and making the house a mess. No, that's definitely not for me. 1 kiddo might be all right, but 3 kiddos at once? It's just too much, Richard thought, wistfully sinking deeper and deeper into depression. The man didn't seem to care the least bit about his wife, who was actually the one who had to carry the multiple pregnancy. Audrey was suffering from terrible morning sickness, coupled with dizziness and weakness, which were her faithful companions for several months. The huge belly didn't let her sleep properly, depriving the exhausted woman of rest even at night. As soon as the babies would quiet down, the other one would start turning and pushing. All of this made Derek smile, but his smile had nothing to do with sympathy or understanding of everything that was happening. The closer it got to the due date, the more anxious Audrey was getting. She had long understood that she couldn't count on her husband's help. Derek was never very caring or compassionate, and he never rushed to help his wife. Now, when according to him, Audrey had turned into a cow, the poor woman knew that it would be foolish to expect anything but cold indifference from her husband. Derek had a very simple explanation for his behavior. Yes, I did want a child, but I wanted 1, not 3. Our family budget cannot afford it. How are we supposed to raise so many freaking kiddos? At such moments, Audrey couldn't help but tear up. How can you speak about your own children that way? Audrey simply couldn't comprehend how anyone could be so cruel. The woman would be willing to give her own life just to ensure her babies were fine. Of course, Audrey didn't blame Derek, even though he was the one who insisted on having a child. Audrey wanted to finish college first and only then start a family, but Derek made the decision for them both and stubbornly insisted on it. Frankly speaking, the man didn't like the rumors that his colleagues had going around, claiming that he couldn't have children or didn't want to, as all he valued in life was money. Ultimately, Derek decided to have a baby because he wanted to deal with the rumors, but it was Audrey who had to make all the sacrifices for it. Every day, the unfortunate woman caught her husband's contemptuous glances. Apparently, the man didn't like that Audrey's body had changed. And what exactly did you expect, dear? I'm carrying 3 babies. You're a smart man. I'm sure you understand what that entails, Audrey said with resentment in her voice. But it was simply impossible to reason with Derek. For some inexplicable reason, he blamed his wife for everything that was happening and didn't want to accept the fact that it was beyond her control. Derek wanted everything to just be as it was before, without all the negative aspects of Audrey's pregnancy. But the upcoming birth wasn't the only reason behind the man's disgraceful behavior. There was another reason that greatly affected the family's current situation. Derek was having an affair. The man was virtually living in 2 families, and while he spent time with Audrey during the day, he usually spent his nights in the arms of his mistress, Susan. It's hard to say whether Audrey knew about it or not, but there was no doubt that she could feel her husband's indifference. Derek was a middle-class businessman whose fortune wasn't estimated in millions and who couldn't dream of even 1,000th place in the Forbes ranking of the richest people. Nevertheless, the man behaved as if he was incredibly rich, doing everything he could to come off as a very wealthy man. It was most likely this kind of attitude that attracted Susan. Derek's stories about his lazy and nagging wife, whom he claimed didn't care about him, definitely had their effect on Susan. She started thinking that Derek was a perfect man who was unfortunate enough to have ended up in a marriage with a horrible woman. Her take on the situation made Derek smile contently. He'd always enjoyed getting attention from women and often used it to his own advantage. Derek was never really in love with Audrey. He only married her to improve his image in the eyes of his coworkers. The truth was that he was a cheap man with many issues who only really cared about money and wealth. "Why don't you get a divorce? You haven't been happy in your marriage for a long time." Susan kept asking the same question over and over again. Derek always tried to steer clear of the awkward subject by changing the topic of the conversation. Looking to avoid making the situation even worse, Derek wasn't exactly opposed to the idea of getting a divorce, but when he thought about the actual process, he felt very uncomfortable. His fear of parting had nothing to do with his feelings for his wife and had a rather simple reasoning behind it. The man was afraid of getting divorced because he would lose most of his assets. Having 3 underage kiddos would definitely tip the scales in Audrey's favor, and thus the divorce would have a detrimental effect on Derek's financial situation. If only those kiddos never got born. That would be a true gift of fate, the man thought. The most horrifying thing was that Derek didn't see anything shameful in such thoughts and believed that it was something most people would feel in this situation. Of course, Audrey had no idea about any of that and was actively preparing for the upcoming birth. She watched all kinds of educational programs and attended various classes for future parents. Since Audrey grew up in an orphanage, she simply had no one to count on for help. Unfortunately, she didn't even have any reliable friends, and it would be foolish to hope that she'd make them after the birth of her 3 babies. Despite the fact that Audrey didn't graduate from the university, she worked in a trading company and only went on maternity leave when she was in her 7th month of pregnancy. The director was a middle-aged man named David Stewart. The man had lost his wife and child in a car accident and therefore treated his pregnant employee with the utmost respect and even a sort of admiration. Even during the early stages of her pregnancy, David always let Audrey go home early so that she could take a much-needed rest. The man was very kind to Audrey, unlike her husband, who pretty much treated her like a servant. When Audrey could no longer work in the office, David always called her up to inquire about her health. Sometimes he even brought over some groceries so that the pregnant woman wouldn't have to drag all those heavy bags home herself. At the same time, there was no ulterior motive to David's actions, which couldn't be said about anything Derek did. As the due date was getting closer, Audrey's husband was becoming increasingly unbearable. Of course, the woman tried to understand the anxiety Derek was feeling, which she believed was caused by the responsibility of having to provide for 3 kiddos at once. Meanwhile, Derek never extended the same kind of understanding towards his wife and continued to criticize her on a daily basis. "Why is our home always such a mess? I feel like I'm living in a pigsty and there's never any food in the fridge," the man screamed at his wife. "Honey, I can't really bend over anymore, and I can't lift anything heavy. The doctors forbade it when I started my 3rd trimester," Audrey answered with tears in her eyes. Deep down, Derek understood that his wife was right, but he still wasn't willing to accept it. Instead of helping Audrey, he spent his nights with Susan, excusing his absence with a heavy workload and many business trips. It just so happened that Audrey had to get ready for the hospital all on her own. Derek not only didn't help his wife pack, but didn't even show up to take her to the hospital. Fortunately, Audrey's boss accidentally learned about it and quickly came to the woman's aid. David Stewart helped her pack and get everything ready for her stay at the hospital. He knew that Audrey was having triplets and therefore sincerely empathized with her. If it weren't for David's help, Audrey wouldn't have been able to get everything ready, but David was there, and in a couple of hours, Audrey was already at the hospital where she was to become a mother in the very near future. "Thank you so much," Audrey whispered with tears in her eyes. The woman felt a little uncomfortable when the hospital staff mistook David for her husband and kept calling the businessman soon-to-be daddy. Meanwhile, David didn't seem to be the least bit fazed by it and took the situation with his usual humility and calmness. He was never ashamed of showing his feelings and valued sincerity and openness in other people. Meanwhile, Derek was spending time with Susan and trying to figure out what to do next. The man had definitely made up his mind about getting a divorce, but he needed to come up with a clear plan of action to make sure that it was as painless for him as possible. The most shocking part was that he had no idea about David Stewart's role in his wife's life. Having left his wife without any care and attention, he never cared about how deeply he was hurting her. Perhaps he was subconsciously trying to get Audrey to get into premature labor so he could blame her for not being able to carry his kiddos to term. As expected, Derek didn't even think about visiting his wife at the hospital, while David, on the contrary, inquired about Audrey's health every day, came to visit her, and helped in every way he could. The doctors never attempted to hide the fact that the birth would be difficult. Audrey knew that a C-section was often preferred in a pregnancy like hers, and that every woman handled the surgery differently, but Derek didn't care. He believed that the doctors knew best and that there was no need for him to get involved in any of the decisions. As is often the case, the contractions took Audrey by surprise. Clutching her belly, the unfortunate woman lay down on the bed and called the nurse. Audrey didn't remember much of what happened next. Unfortunately, the doctors were right, and Audrey did have to have a C-section. During the surgery, the woman lost a lot of blood and needed a transfusion. There was no one Audrey could count on for help. Derek was out of reach again, and therefore no one else could donate blood for her. At that moment, David Stewart came to visit Audrey and immediately volunteered to help. The businessman's blood type was a match, which meant that he could be Audrey's donor. Derek was actually well aware of the situation his wife was in, but he didn't even feel the need to call her. Moreover, it was actually at that point that he decided to get a divorce. Having gotten some misinformation from one of the nurses, the man decided that the babies didn't survive and that he no longer had anything stopping him from getting the divorce. "It's the right thing to do, dear," Susan said, believing that her time had finally come. Sure, most people would see their actions as despicable, but Susan and Derek were used to only ever thinking about themselves and thus didn't see anything wrong in what they were doing. While Audrey was recovering from the difficult labor, Derek quickly finalized the divorce. Moreover, he didn't even bother to notify his wife, who had just given birth to 3 healthy babies. All this time, Derek stayed by Audrey's side and helped her in every way he could. The medical staff kept wondering what made this seemingly successful and well-off man want to take care of someone else's wife and children. In order to file for divorce in absentia, Derek had to use all of his connections. The fact that Audrey had to spend about 2 weeks in the hospital actually helped the man. During this time, Derek managed to pull off the divorce scam. The way he saw it, his plan was flawless. There was, however, one thing that Derek didn't count on, and that was the fact that the babies didn't actually die and that his now ex-wife was also getting better. Needless to say, the man was beyond surprised when he learned the truth. "Well, there's no way for me to avoid going to court now, which means that I'm going to lose 70% of all of my assets," Derek thought anxiously. When Audrey found out about the divorce, her outrage knew no bounds. That was the last straw for the unfortunate woman. "Derek filed for divorce when I was on the brink of death. How is that even possible?" Audrey sat with tears in her eyes. But the main surprise was waiting for the young mother when she was getting discharged. David was waiting for her with a huge bouquet of roses. Tears welled up in Audrey's eyes. She definitely didn't expect that. Leading the hospital to the loud applause of the staff, the young mother and her 3 babies got into David's car. If he hadn't shown up to help Audrey yet again, the poor woman would have had a very tough time getting home. But David was an amazing man who surrounded Audrey with the kind of care and attention that she never knew in her life. Moreover, David promised to take care of her children as if they were his own. He also recommended that Audrey refrain from suing her ex-husband for part of his assets. "Take my word for it, that lowlife will eventually get what he deserves," the businessman said. Derek was genuinely surprised when he learned that his wife dropped the lawsuit. "That's our chance," Susan exclaimed. The way she saw it, there was nothing standing in the way of their happiness anymore. Audrey was taking care of the babies and enjoying life with David. Of course, their relationship had nothing to do with love at first. It started off as a friendship united by common goals and objectives, but eventually, their friendship developed into something much bigger, and Audrey and David realized that they were in love with each other. The most incredible part, however, was that David's prediction came true, and Derek did get what he deserved, all because he decided to connect his life with the eccentric woman named Susan. They broke up 6 months after the wedding, and this time Derek did lose half of his assets in the divorce. Only then did Derek realize what a terrible mistake he'd made by leaving his kind and reasonable Audrey for a headstrong Susan. Susan got most of Derek's assets in the divorce, leaving him on the verge of bankruptcy. Since there was no turning back, Derek decided to try and make up with Audrey. Of course, the young mother wanted nothing to do with her ex-husband. The woman was well aware of what being in a relationship with this man implied. Getting constantly criticized and put down. Looking at his children with tears in his eyes, Derek realized that there was nothing more important on earth than those 3 smiling babies who should have been the meaning of his life. Having met David's eyes, Derek understood everything without words. He said a quiet goodbye and quietly left David's home. In later years, Derek repeatedly tried starting over and starting a new family, but the businessman never managed to find another woman who could provide him with the kind of care and comfort he had with Audrey.